Yeah.
Might as well. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining the investigator meeting, which hopefully won't zoom you out or Teams you out or anything, and hopefully will be interesting and show you where we are with the project and how we get to the final push. So the agenda is reasonably light, and we hope you've left a good chunk of time for questions and answers and discussions. So feel free to bring anything you want to the table. We're going to just get a brief trial update from Joe Lucas at NHSBT, who's our trial manager, and then Helen Thomas, who's the trial statistician, will be running through the data that we're allowed to look at from the 1,000 patient analysis. And then Ross, who you all know, I think, is going to go through just some areas that we want to focus on for the next few months. And then we've got general discussion, things you want to raise, things you want to talk about, some updates from some sites. We've got a couple of presentations of relevant research which has come out over the past year or so, which we thought we'd just do 5 minutes on each if we've got time and if you want us to. And then we're going to introduce the US Coordinating Center at University of Texas at Houston with Erin Fox, who are hopefully finally coming online for the last bit of the trial. So hopefully we should be done before 4 o'clock, if not at 4 o'clock. And but I think in general, you know, this meeting is really just to say thank you for everything you've done so far. We know it's been extraordinarily challenging over the past few months. You know, even the trial was tough at the best of times because of its logistical challenges and things, but then trying to keep going as much as everyone did during the pandemic has been really impressive. And actually we've been shut down for a very, very short period of time compared to some other trials, and there's really been an effort to get patients recruited and the study going, which we're very grateful to all the sites that are going on. We are at 81% of recruitment. We've got 290 patients left to recruit in 8 months, and which is very doable, I think. But it is going to need a bit of sort of focus and making sure we're not missing patients, and also making sure that the quality of the enrollment doesn't drop off in the last few months. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So I hope that sounds like a plan. I am going to hand over to Joe, who's going to give you a general trial update. We're going to keep you all on mute, if that's okay, just because there are a lot of you. There's 66 people online. So put any questions in the chat and we'll pick them up as we go, either in the chat or as we do either things highlighted we'll talk about in the Q&A, or we'll pick them up as they go. But do put things in the chat as you feel free. If you desperately want to talk, put your hand up and we'll consider your request. Apart from Simon. Oh yeah, okay, go on, Simon.
Oh, I was just going to say, Kareem, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think we've passed 1,000 patients, which still is an unbelievable achievement, and I just wanted to recognise that. I think you'll remind me, Kareem, if I'm wrong, but I think that target came about the time of lockdown, didn't it? At a very difficult time, but it still is an unbelievable trial and the numbers. So I think there's apologies we haven't been able to meet face to face, but I would just like to recognise that milestone. And as Kareem was saying, it's just under 300 patients to complete what will be a fantastic study.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think much has been made of the success of recovery in the COVID trials for the scale of recruitment that they've done, but a 1,200 patient so far trauma trial is in this critical level of patients is also pretty unique worldwide, and showcases the power of the UK major trauma system, really, I think, together with the the support we've had from NHSBT and the NIHR. So I think it bodes well for the future, as well as of trauma research, as well as for this trial. Anyway, enough self-congratulation. I'm going to hand over to Jo.
Really?
Where are you, Jo?
I'm right here. Hopefully you should be able to see the slides.
Yeah.
I know they're all in widescreen.
Yeah,
yes?
they're good.
Okay, lovely. So just to echo really Karen and Simon's welcome. It's so lovely seeing everyone, and it makes a big change from you all being in a lecture theatre, which is a little odd, but I'm going to talk basically about the trial status and where we are today. So in terms of introductions, I think these four, most of you know already. So Karen and Simon, chief investigators of the study, and Nikki Curry, who's a consultant haematologist, and Ross Davenport, who is a trauma surgeon. So these are our four main investigators in the study. Since you all came in 2019, there's been quite a lot of staff turnover as well at site, but also with us at CTU. So I just wanted to put faces to names of people in the trial management teams. There's Claire, myself, and Amy. Claire looks after a portfolio of studies, of which CRYOSTAT is one. Then in clinical trial statistics, we have lovely Helen Thomas and Alice, who's joined the team to help us. And data management as well, we have Rupert and Nikki and Roshni. Pretty much all of the sites we've heard from at least one of those to do with data queries. So as Karen said, it's been really extraordinary the last year and a half, and we really do appreciate it that you're still supporting the study, which is vitally important anyway. But of course, in the second lockdown, the CRN was quite strict about nurses that they'd funded should stay working on urgent care studies. We were very happy about that. So the main things that have happened since the last meeting was we're really happy that this huge enthusiasm for the study is still continuing. It's just amazing. It's just as high as it was a couple of years ago, and in fact from the start. Everyone's still really committed to answering the research question and relevant, looking at its international implications. And people have continued recruiting during the pandemic, which is just amazing considering the reduced capacity that site had. And also the NIHR has been extremely supportive in allowing an extension to the study so that we can reach our target of 1,568 patients. So as far as new sites, we've got 2 new sites coming on board, the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, and also our US coordinating site in Houston. So in terms of what happened in the last year, this is beginning of March 2020 during lockdown 1, and quite a lot of the sites were still open towards end of March, beginning of April. I think we had 4 sites still recruiting before we briefly had a study pause. Just so that we recognised, the position was a little bit untenable at the time. And when we reopened in May, some sites started opening, of course, with Royal London being first, but others following shortly on and getting the green light to recommence recruitment. But of course, some sites didn't have that capacity and have continued on with their staff redeployed into clinical care. In terms of from May last year to April this year, again, we had some sites still suspended, but a lot more sites reopening. So that by October last year, we had most of the sites open and just a handful who were closed for capacity issues until April. And we're hoping that the last 3 sites will come on board by the end of April. So we're very happy with that. We had restarts calls with Trust prior to reopening to make sure everything's in place, like all the right amendments, the right forms and everything like that. So that was nice, and we got to sort of touch base with everyone again, which we haven't been able to do because of obviously we won't be able to physically come and see you for monitoring visits. So some of you who've got children and some of you who haven't will know that this is The Incredibles. And really what we mean by this, we mean you, the site staff. So the original UK target of 1,142 patients expected to be reached in June last year, and we still reached that target relatively soon, despite everything that was going on in October 2020. So that's an amazing achievement, and thank you. Again, we got the NIHR extension, and we just had approval, and I've been sending through some of the amendments this morning, that we are extended in the UK and US sites recruitment to our target. So anyone who recruited during a worldwide pandemic to a non-COVID study is doing really, really well. And actually we had 278 patients recruited during that time. So that's absolutely amazing achievement. And our overall recruitment is 1,276 patients, and that's 81% of our target. And that's just incredible. Over 3 years to recruit all of those patients is awesome. So we've got 292 to go, which is just amazing. And, we're hoping to recruit them before the end of the year or at some point after the end of the year. So at the moment, a lovely picture of Houston down here, and as well all the UK sites here. So at the moment, we've got 20 sites open. We've got 2 sites in setup. We've got 3 sites paused for capacity, and we've got 1 site is closed because if you remember, Brighton left us in 2018 because of a change in their major hemorrhage protocol. So these new sites, lovely University of Texas Healthcare Science in Houston. You have a very impressive building that reminds me a little bit of Senate House in London, but also Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, which is obviously got a little bit of building envy going on there compared to NHSB2. So there's been a lot of changes this year in terms of research teams. We've had to say goodbye to Tony Kehoe from Plymouth, who's retired, and also Jonathan Thornley, who's the PI at Leeds, who's been stepping back from research, and also a few research nurses. Most have changed roles to different MTCs, which is lovely, but some have moved on to more clinical roles. So in terms of new people who have come, and we're very happy to see them, as Alice Downs and Michael Harrison have taken over from Jonathan Thornley at Leeds, and also Jason Smith has taken over at Southampton, and also we've got Adil Akhtar, who's a Belfast PI, and also Brian Cotton in the States, who's head of Houston. Sadly, the other day we also learned that Paul from Hull is moving on, and we will miss him, especially at our next investigators meeting, which we hope will be in person, and we will be very sad not to see his hats. So our current focus in the study is really about getting the US and Belfast open, and we're hoping that Belfast will open sort of late April when our substantial amendment is approved, and the US are probably following on at the end of April, beginning of May. So continuing recruitment, obviously, at the moment, and all the queries from sites and issues around consent and things we're resolving with you. We've got this substantial amendment in that includes electronic consent and consultee forms at the moment. And these are PDFs that are locked, except for the places that people need to sign and for you to fill out the randomization number. And we're hoping that the REC will say that yes to that. So we're starting to resume monitoring activities, and I know Amy and myself have been in touch with different trusts that we're going to be monitoring probably in the next month. And we're now moving to central monitoring because obviously, sadly, we can't visit. And this largely involves collection of data queries by Rupert, and we can send forms on to you so that you can do a lot of the work before we have a phone call and just run through everything. So there's a bit of a less pressured thing there than us just coming to site and saying, oh, thanks very much, we'd like to go through this. There's actually a chance for you to do this in advance. So we've got follow-up data collection that will be starting soon, and Helen and the team will be requesting patient identifiable information from you for patients who have signed informed consent, and for those who are included in our Section 251 support, to gain mortality data from NHS Digital and the 6-month data of quality of life from TARN. So that's an extremely big task for us, and watch out, in a few weeks we'll be sending this stuff to you. So the other thing we're sending out is more pens and notepads. I thought, you know, normally we would do that when you're here, but of course now we're doing it virtually, so we're just going to send them out to sites, so something to look forward to in the next week or so. That is me, I'm afraid. Other than saying thank you so much for continuing in the study and just being amazing and helping us so much. We've missed seeing you all.
Thanks, Jo. So again, any questions or comments or thoughts, please pop them in the chat, but otherwise we will move straight on to Helen.
Thank you, Corinne. Okay, so I was asked to just give you an update on the data from the first 1,000 patients recruited into the trial. And I just want to acknowledge Alice's help with this, the support statistician who's joined the trial. Thank you, Alice. So 1,000 patients was an important milestone for us because it was the final planned interim analysis for the trial. We had these sort of 3 planned interim analyses when the trial started at 300, 500 and 1,000 patients. And then the DMC asked us to add in a second sample size re-estimation partway through the study. So we did that at 750 patients. But the really good news was that we passed all of those hurdles along the way. And at each point, the DMC have advised that the trial should continue and that it should continue to its original sample size with no increase required. So that's fantastic news. We've come over those 4 hurdles and now really we're on the home straight now of the final recruitment to the target. So I'm going to share some data on those first 1,000 patients, but I just wanted to first of all thank you all for all the data that you've been providing that enables us to share this data today. So if we looked at all the patients who've been randomised up to the end of December last year, we've now got 93% of the CRFs on the database and able for us to analyse, which is great. And of those patients, the primary outcome was complete for 97% of them. So that's really positive news on the data quality side of things. So thank you very much for all you're doing in returning CRFs and responding to queries. So I'm just going to start by taking you through a few baseline characteristics of the patients who've been enrolled in the study. So we can see that 78% of participants are male, and the top right hand side shows you the histogram by age. So the median age for recruitment into the trial is 39 years, but you can see there's really quite a big spread going right up into the 80s and 90s of patients enrolled. About 2/3 of the participants have blunt injuries rather than penetrating injuries. And this graph shows the total injury severity score where we've had it reported. So the median injury severity score of 27. At the top here, I've just presented some histograms of the systolic blood pressure at admission and the heart rate. Both nice bell-shaped curves, which I like to see as a statistician. And at the bottom, the Glasgow Coma Scale, which really is sort of dichotomized with about half the participants completely unconscious and unable to respond, and the others right at the opposite end of the scale with a GCS score of 14 or 15. This slide just shows you about some of the treatment that patients have had prior to admission to hospital. So we've got the number of red cells that are given pre-hospital. Again, the majority haven't had any prior to admission, but there are a few patients who've obviously had some red cells on their way into hospital. Again, FFP units are shown in the top right and crystalloids in the bottom left. And we can also see that 80% of our participants have had tranexamic acid before being admitted to hospital. So that sort of summarises some of the characteristics about the patients. I just wanted to move on a little bit to talk about compliance with the intervention. You'll remember this is something that we talked about quite a lot at the last investigators meeting, and I'm afraid I'm going to talk about it again. So obviously what we're always trying to achieve is for those randomised to the yearly cryoprecipitate that they are given the cryo and that they're given it quickly. within 90 minutes of admission and within 3 hours of injury. And this just summarises our sort of our compliance with achieving that by 2 different time periods, roughly before and after our last investigators meeting, and roughly half and half of recruitment. And ultimately what we're trying to get is this red proportion to be as high as possible, and you can see that in the early part of the trial about 58% of patients were getting the cryoprecipitate exactly as we would like as per protocol, and that has actually dropped off slightly in the second half down to 53%. So really just want to keep giving that message about wherever possible giving the cryoprecipitate as quickly as you're able to. And this graph shows the same sort of information. So the blue line is the proportion of patients who've been given cryo, and the red line is the proportion of patients who've been given it all entirely according to the protocol. And we're just showing how that compliance has changed over time. And interestingly, the last investigators meeting was just before this hump in the red curve. So I like to think that the last time we had this conversation back in London 2 years ago, it did have a bit of an impact on what happened in sites, and we did see an improvement in compliance shortly after that. But as you can see, latterly it has dropped off down again closer to the 50% mark. So sort of hoping that today's investigator meeting, which just enthuse you all to go away and produce another sort of hump on the end of this graph as we approach the end of the study. You might remember that I showed you these graphs last time. So this is presenting the data by site about giving the intervention. So on the left here are your site codes, which is what goes on your CRF. So hopefully your teams are familiar with which site they are, and the overall data is shown at the bottom. And so this is just showing from admission to hospital how long on average it takes to randomise participants, 19 minutes on average, and then how long it takes to actually give the first pool of cryo. So on average that takes 53 minutes, and obviously we're trying to get it all below this target of 90 minutes overall. And generally you can see the vast majority of sites are achieving that. These are obviously averages. Sometimes patients have longer times than others, but on average most sites are achieving that. There are a couple of sites here who on average exceed 90 minutes quite regularly. So it's just a little sort of prompt for you all to go away and have a look at where you appear on these charts and see whether there's anything you could do to perhaps shorten your time to randomisation and so on. The next graph is the same data, but I've added in this blue bar, which is how long it takes the patient to get to hospital. Obviously that isn't in your control. And in fact, some of the sites with the longest times for patients to arrive at the top here actually then are very quick in giving the intervention and manage to get it in before the 3-hour mark. So that's good news. So just a final reminder really, as we cross that 1,000 patient hurdle, just to make sure that if they're in the cryo arm, you've got your bag of cryo with you and you're racing to give it as quickly as you can. So I'll move on just briefly to share a little bit of what happens to the patients after the intervention. So this is some early mortality data, what happens in the first 24 hours. So we can see 8% of patients die in the first 6 hours and 12% in the first 24. I think reflecting obviously the patient population and kind of as we might have expected. This slide at the top shows the hospital stay for the patients enrolled, which is a median of 11 days. But really it looks very different according to whether the patients survived or not. So in the bottom left are the patients who survived, where you can see quite a spread of times in hospital and a clump at 28 days, patients who were still in hospital at the end of the study. Whereas in those who died, obviously those deaths typically occurring much earlier in the patient's hospital stay. This slide shows the different blood products given in the first 24 hours after admission. So on average, there's a median of 4 units of red cells given, 4 units of FFP. For cryoprecipitate, the median is 2, but obviously that's split very much between the 2 arms of the trial. So roughly half the patients not getting any cryo in the first 24 hours, and then a good chunk getting the full 3 pools, some of them getting slightly more and slightly less. And on the bottom right, we've got the number of platelet units given, which is much less common. And these graphs just show the use of crystalloids and colloids in the first 24 hours, very few colloids being given at all. In terms of SAEs, when we extracted the data, we'd had 387 SAEs reported across the trial as a whole, and that related to 374 different patients. So on average, we're seeing 0.33 SAEs per participant. And about 9.2% of those enrolled have had a thromboembolic event reported to us. And that was all I was going to say. So I'll hand back to Simon and Corinne.
Thanks, Helen. I think for me, it's what's interesting about the data is there are a very sick group of patients who are dying, and they're pretty much the patients that we expected to see, and they're pretty much hitting the mortality levels that we expected we would be getting. So I think that's good. I think the other thing that is probably even more important is how coherent and homogeneous the care that they're being given is. So across all the major trauma centres, you know, with lots of different geographies and lots of different systems, it's incredible how coherent and of high quality the care that they're being given is getting. You know, whether it's, you know, the red cell to plasma ratio that they're getting, the fact that they're not getting much in the way of crystalloid. You know, I don't think you'd see that in any other, you know, in many other countries in the world, to see, you know, how there is such a, you know, a high standard and, you know, an equitable standard of care. So I think that, you know, also is, you know, a very good sign for the quality of the study and the underlying care that is given to these patients. Dan, was that a hand?
No, it was accidental. Apologies.
You can say something if you like.
Congratulations.
I'm going to hand over to Simon to lead the Q&A and discussion, but yeah, we want to hear from you guys.
Yeah, this is very much just a chance now just to hear a bit of feedback. I mean, the only other thought I had just looking at those slides from Helen was it's really quite reassuring to see that separation of the cryoprecipitate use. You know, we are here testing two ways of using cryoprecipitate, and you know, in my way of just looking at the histogram, you know, there really are two different groups of patients, some getting cryo, some not, and I think that's really important. So for me, that was one of the histograms I was taking away. So what we usually do at these events when we've been holding them is we try to give a chance to go around all the sites and try to get a little bit of feedback and questions. It's always more difficult when you're doing this virtually. I'm looking down the list and I'm recognizing a number of colleagues here, including some hematology background, but are there any comments, or maybe first of all, just to start, are there any questions to ask in terms of the presentations, you know, the feedback you've had so far from Joe and Helen? Anyone got anything they want to ask?
I think we should start with Dan. How are things going at Salford?
Go for it.
Thank you. So we've, I think, continued to recruit slowly, I would say, over the year. I think, you know, a big positive for this trial would be the enthusiasm, as you mentioned, and the fact that it's relatively prioritised because of the acuity of the intervention. So our research teams have been able to carry on delivering it and have managed to avoid, in some circumstances, being seconded elsewhere. And then the clinicians in the ED have been very much behind continuing to deliver this intervention. We've seen a slight drop off in our trauma rate during the worst of the pandemic, the incidents, and of course when the pool gets diluted, then it's harder for people to remember in terms of timeliness of the intervention. And we've been trying to do alternate rounds of comms just to remind people on a fairly frequent basis. But you know, it's been a good trial to continue recruiting to, and I think some of these numbers, I don't know if you're planning to share the slides, but I think, I mean, I'll certainly sort of circulate my thoughts from this meeting to try and re-galvanise everyone for the last 300, because I think it's hugely positive to see the numbers that have been achieved. The fact that we're kind of in the final straight almost, as well as you taking on additional sites.
Okay, so I'm picking up a few questions. So I think there are 1 or 2 questions, Joe, about sharing slides, but I don't think there should be any problems with that. Does anyone have any questions? I think there was some feedback in the chat box from the group in Wales, in Cardiff. So I don't know, is anyone here to talk to the situation in Cardiff? How's anything from there?
We've only so far managed to recruit 1 subject, because the study team aren't part of the ED, so I'm not sure exactly what the situation is in the ED at the moment. So we're reliant on the trauma practitioners to identify patients for us. So, but we have had 1 successful participant recruited, and that's where we are at the moment in Cardiff, I'm afraid.
I mean, I know I came down to Cardiff a couple of times. Obviously, it was a while ago, but again, if there's something I can do or one of us can do to help kind of energise in this last 9 months, please let us know. I can see a hand up, but I can't see who it is because it's just right next to a number of 64. So whoever's put the hand up, feel free to speak.
Oh, hi, it's Edwin Massey from working in the Welsh Blood Service. Not being involved in the study, very impressive effort, amazing recruitment, given all the other challenges going on. I popped a question in the chat. I think I may have misheard the rates of thromboembolism, but I just wanted to check. Prof. Broe mentioned that the mortality rate was what was kind of expected for this severity of trauma, but was the thromboembolic rate, does anyone know if that's sort of on par with what would be expected too?
Yeah, so the rate depends on the type of patient that you're getting in, but I think most places at the moment are seeing rates between about sort of 7 and 15%, depending on the cases. And I think there's a clear signal that the sicker patients are more likely to get this procoagulant picture later on, and they become thromboembolic. It's interesting. It's not just venous thromboembolism; it's also arterial thrombi as well. So myocardial infarction, stroke type pictures. So it's definitely something to look at. But it's within a range. Whether there'll be a difference between the groups, we'll have to see.
Dan, I think your hand's gone up again. Or I hope it's not. Is it? I don't think it's a legacy hand because it went off and came back on. So presumably there's a question now. Feel free.
There is all types of hands today for me, Simon. So I was going to ask about the Feisty trial, I suppose, and the implications for this. I know a lot of the people on the call were involved in that. I think it's smaller. The conclusions seem to me to be, that CRYOSTAT 2 will use that body of evidence and they'll be mutually beneficial. But I wondered if you'd heard from any sites who are now willing to recruit to CRYOSTAT 2 or have changed their practice based on Feisty, or if it's had any impact on the trial at all.
I wonder if I can hand over to Nikki on this one, since I know, Nikki, you've had probably quite a lot of contact with the with the group down there, and obviously had a lot to do with you and Ross with the viscoelastic guidelines. It might be worth, if you don't mind me saying, Nikki, perhaps you could just remind everyone what the Feisty trial was about. There may be 1 or 2 individuals who aren't quite as, haven't heard about it in the same way.
Okay, thanks, Simon. So the Feisty study was again a pilot study that was run in Australia. across quite a few sites, looking at the feasibility really and the speed with which either fibrinogen concentrate or cryoprecipitate could be given to trauma patients. But unlike CRYOSTAT, where it's the patient is recruited according to clinical parameters, i.e. blood pressure, and looking like they have a major bleeding event, these patients also had to have all of that, but also had to have a ROTEM, a viscoelastic test that suggested that the fibrinogen level was low. So if you look at the data, they recruited 100 patients, and looking at the data, quite a lot of those patients actually, although were recruited, then had their ROTEM and then were not eligible to receive any fibrinogen replacement because their ROTEM test was not low enough. They are applying for funding for FEISTI-2, but I don't think that, if I understood you right, Dan, and I might not, so please, if I'm not answering your question, I will answer your question, but I think there hasn't certainly been any change in Australia about what they're doing at the current time in light of the FEISTI results, because I'm not sure. Particularly, they may suggest that the fibrinogen is able to be given a little bit more quickly, but I think that's possibly all that it's able to show at the moment, if I'm honest. I don't think it shows much more than that. If anyone's got anything to add to that, please do. Did I answer your question, Dan?
Yeah, you did, and it sounds by implication that you haven't had any sites that have raised concerns about ongoing participation in CRYOSTAT-2, and that everyone's happy to continue in the UK.
Yeah, no,
No, I don't think we have.
I think the difference with CRYOSTAT-2 is that it will be this is an efficacy study, isn't it? It's ultimately answering the question: is fibrinogen replacement going to help the patient? Whereas FEISTI none of the previous studies have yet done anything to that extent, and so really everyone's waiting for the result of this, to be honest.
Which is great, isn't it? I mean, we're just going through strange times for evidence-based medicine at the moment, and people are changing practice based on very limited data during the pandemic. I wondered if any of that had crossed over. And I remember we talked about fibrinogen concentrate in the first investigator meeting quite extensively, didn't we? And the challenges that that might throw up. But I'm pleased to hear, that you that we all have similar opinions on this, and that we're proceeding.
Yeah, Dan, Nikki, thanks for that. Again, I don't know whether is this Edwin back from Wales. Is this a legacy hand or is this a different hand?
It's a different hand. Apologies for saying so much when I've had so little to do. That's probably why I'm asking. I was just thinking about the things that were discussed then. I wondered whether the pandemic itself, it obviously would have affected recruitment, as Daniel pointed out and was mentioned, that sort of reduced trauma cases across parts of the country. But do you think may there be other impacts? I mean, I was thinking on the thrombosis risk. Obviously, coronavirus increases thrombosis risk, and the vaccination. Whether this the sort of year that's overlapped with this, it might actually be sort of putting other things other variables into the study that might be different between the period pre-pandemic and the period post-pandemic.
I think it's possible, Edwin, but I think we were seeing that rate pre-pandemic as well. In the other interim analysis, we've had that rate before. In fact, I think at one point we were up to 11%, if my memory serves me correctly. So, and we're not sure, of course, how many of these patients actually had COVID, but we don't.
And I would also guess I would add to that. Sorry, Karim. I'd add to that these patients are randomised into the two arms, so that although it might show a slight increase overall, it's not going to differentiate between whether someone's had or hasn't had cryo. Increase the risk.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see what impacts of the pandemic had on the study participants, though, if you've got a large cohort that were within the pandemic and a large cohort that weren't. But it's just a side thought, and it wasn't a pre-analysis, so probably shouldn't be done at all.
We've got our translation on the line. You shouldn't even suggest anything like that. You should be breaking out into sweats already.
See a few chats from Manchester. I don't know whether Simon Simon's still there. May have gone, but you sounds like you've been able to keep going. Any issues, or anyone else want to share any issues?
Something from Southampton, Simon. Mary.
Yeah, hi. We just had a quick question about our HEMS team have started giving early fibrinogen to patients who are code-redded. And this, unfortunately, I think we had a discussion with Joe, and this is making a lot of our patients ineligible. So when we go down there, if they've had the pre-hospital fibrinogen, we can't then give them the more. And obviously a lot of our code-red patients have had it, like that's the patients we're recruiting. So we realised yesterday that we're going to probably struggle for recruitment if they're giving it to patients that we want to go see.
Hi, Simon.
Yes.
Sorry, it's Kerry. Can I just mention something there? Actually,
Kerry.
only one pre-hospital patient has had fibrinogen so far. So I think there's probably some internal work to do there around confusion about who's carrying it and who's actually had it. So the air ambulance is carrying fibrinogen, but only one patient has actually been given it. So I think probably we need to meet up internally with Liz. Is that who was speaking on the call just now? It's one of our research team.
It's Mary.
Hi, Mary. So I think we probably
now.
need to meet up internally to discuss that. I think there's some communication confusion there. But our PI did have a chat with the CRYOSTAT team, and it is listed as we can't enrol them if they've been given fibrinogen pre-hospital, but only one patient since we've been live has had it. So I think that's an internal thing to discuss.
Kerry, that's really helpful. I think it's slightly difficult to hear. It's the dreaded masks, but I think don't worry. You and I have spoken about this. I mean, Mary is, I've offered, but if this is something you want to have a discussion with, or you want one of us to help out, but I think these numbers are very small numbers, but it does preclude these from the trial, and obviously it's for the. Our focus really is on as much as we can in the next 9 months, completing recruitment for this trial to try and answer the really important definitive question about, is there a role for a concentrated form of fibrinogen? And I think there are some later questions then about which is the best concentrated form of fibrinogen. But I think it's really important to see if what we can learn about a role for one of the concentrated forms. That's certainly my take on this. But Kerry, Mary, I've certainly been in touch with Kerry about this and happy to talk about that. So if you talk about that locally, let me know.
Yeah, so I'll catch up with Mary and then we'll come back to you, Simon, if we've got any more questions or we need any more input on that.
I think I saw a chat from Simon from Manchester. I think he's on another call, but maybe listening in. But I think he's quite right, and we're very grateful for all of the sites. But just at the moment, if you're able to try and re-energize recruitment, for the next the 9 months or so that we can really finish this trial, and whatever helps you locally to try and to re-energize. If you want one of us to not what I'm saying, but I can always send Kareem to go and give a talk. He gives fantastic talks. But if you want one of us on the investigator side to participate in a meeting, let us know. But please just try and very grateful for your thoughts, but please just try and focus efforts in these next 6 months, 9 months. And obviously all of it's quality as much as quantity. So picking up on Helen's points about, the pathways, the procedures to get that cryo in quickly as possible so that we can answer the question. I can see, I'm sorry, I'm probably missing a few chats that maybe Kareem's picking up 1 or 2 of them, but I think that was Liverpool I didn't. The message went too quickly, so I didn't read it. But I don't know if there's someone from Aintree. Was it? Was there anything to say?
Yeah, it's John from Aintree. Just to let you know that we're going back live in the next 2 weeks. Now our research nurses are being redeployed back to post-COVID, so we should be back up going in the next 2 weeks.
And actually, I think some of us opening up for non-COVID research. I mean, I can see Alex and Sally in Oxford. I mean, I think that's the situation for us, isn't it, as well?
We've been open a while. We just really haven't had very much trauma. And the nurses have been busy with COVID. So yeah, we'll be back on track soon, I hope.
My trauma colleagues always tell me that summer gets a busier time, so maybe it's a good idea to be ready just in case there's a bit of post-lockdown celebration. But is there a Leeds? And yeah, forgotten Leeds. I can't see who that is, but anything from the Leeds site?
Yeah, we're planning on sort of reopening and getting going in the next week or two. So hopefully we're just getting everything lined up to restart.
Thank you. Joe, we've probably heard from about half of our sites. Probably better not, I don't want to take up more time, but is there anyone else? Not that we're going around, you know, kind of interrogating everyone, but this is meant to be a kind of open chat. Have you picked up anything, Joe, in some conversations with sites in the last couple of months that might be worth sharing? Any points for discussion with us?
Yeah, I think you know, part of our kind of restarting sites is really about asking if there's any new research staff. And there's quite a lot of new people who've come along, and just to let us know, and then we'll do the training and arrange training for people centrally. It's always nice to see people who are new to the study in research, so it's good to meet everyone, but just let us know if that's the case. Plus, Anne Caroline's in the top of my screen. How's it going over there?
Hello, can you hear me? So we had the refill trial running up until December, which was definitely stopping some of our recruitment. And then obviously the post-COVID fatigue of everybody in our departments working differently, sort of getting back on track from that. But we were very fortunate in that our research nurses came back very early to start back with recruitment again. So we've been very fortunate with that.
Thank you, Caroline. And I can see the, well, I think I can see the Coventry group. Is there anything from how things in?
Caroline is in Coventry, Simon.
Oh,
Sam and I, we're just in different rooms.
Trying to confuse me.
That's all right, but we've been lucky because we've been back since the middle of last summer. Helping with recruitment, but people have recruited when we haven't been there as well. They don't always need the research nurses to hold their hand. And we recruited our most recent patient last week.
Well, I think if there are no more questions, so if any other questions for Helen, Joe, or anything to share, otherwise we'll go back to the agenda. Thank you very much. And, you know, as always, you know, Joe and the team, I know they're picking up all the questions. So you know who to contact. And let's, you know, it's kind of what we can do this year to finish the trial and make it a real success. I think it's over to Ross now.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. So I've just been asked to do a couple of minutes on things to focus on for 2021. Although we're nearly halfway through, it seems that we need to refocus our efforts for the last bit of 2021. At times like this, clearly you need to look for some inspiration and stirring quotations, which lots of us probably will have searched for during the very dark 12 months we've all lived through. But in reality, it's probably more something like this, which is certainly the sort of thing that my wife will say to me when I moan a lot of the time. But I think, overall, to actually have the challenges we've all faced, personally and professionally, but to deliver a trial on this scale, meet the academic challenge and still keep recruiting, as everyone has said, is actually phenomenal. The trial itself was already exceeded the recruitment for any transfusion trial in trauma, but to have done it in a pandemic is just absolutely an amazing achievement. So join everyone in congratulating ourselves, although we have got a little way to go. Just in terms of the site feedback, it's really interesting to hear from everybody. And as we know, everyone runs the trial in a slightly different way, both in terms of how patients are identified, where the study teams are based, how patients are randomised. And what I would suggest to people, certainly the newer sites that are coming back on, or people that have had a large changeover of staff, is we can put you in touch with other centres that you may not be familiar with who are operating in a similar way, because sometimes it's difficult for a very high volume site like Mary's and a smaller site to actually be able to work out some of the finer points, and we can help you navigate and put you in touch with people if you feel that would be helpful, just to refocus and re-energise for the final run-in. Clearly, the main focus, though, for 2021 is just to get over the line and to get those final patients in. There's a couple other bits that we do just need to re-emphasise, really, as we have done in previous meetings, and you've heard from Helen as well. Just to say about the recruitment, clearly the good news is we're at 1,254 at the end of March. The less good news is we have now a condensed timeline to get to that 1,568. Now that number 314 was based on the March data. We've recruited a few more since then. But just to show you how possible it absolutely is, this is the randomisation graph for 2019. So this is pre-COVID, those halcyon days when we could go to the pub freely. This was what happened in 2020. So you can see that flat line of recruitment through the first lockdown starting in March. And then we slowly started picking up again as the year went on. 2021 started off slowly as we were back in lockdown again, but actually to get to the final number, we don't really need to go much above where we were during that slower recruitment at the tail end of 2020. So it is absolutely achievable. We will have more sites this time as well, and we'll also have our colleagues in Houston enrolling patients as well. So bottom line, I think, and clear, is that actually this is an achievable target, most definitely. That if you look at the actual numbers that we need collectively per month, this is just broken down again into pre-COVID, and then the targets that we need overall in April to December is 35. Just in terms of the data bits that we need to do now to get the linkage with NHS Digital and TARN, so we can actually start looking at 6 and 12-month mortality data, and actually the 6-month data, we need to do this link, and we're going to do that by the consent data that we have on the CRFs, so we can actually do this link appropriately, and we'll be restarting the collection of the identifiable data by the spreadsheets we'll send to sites. What this means is that on the CRF form, there is this consent form here. This is what we need back from sites so that we can do that linkage, both for all the patients that have been enrolled and then any of the future enrolments from now on in. This is the spreadsheet that will be coming to you from the CTU. This is a slight change to the previous one that we were doing that was put on hold. And in essence, basically, if we've already had the data and it's been provided, we do not need this again, and we will just be very clear in actually what is required from the sites, so that we don't run into any problems around the actual data linkage and what we can and can't do. Just the final thing around the screening logs, to please, every time you go to a potential patient who could be enrolled, just continue to capture that on the screening log so we can have accurate data for those randomised and those not meeting criteria, so that we have accurate data for that. So the end is most definitely in sight, I think, both for getting our lives back on track, but also seeing the end of the trial. And I'll leave you with this image. If you remember the B&Q advert, sometimes it's not always that plain sailing. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ross. Any questions or comments, thoughts on that? Sounds doable. The numbers do look in our favour, so I think if we can have a good summer, we'll be well on the way. So it's all dependent on the next few months, I think, but I think it's doable. Sally.
Sorry, Karim, really for Ross and probably for Joe as well. Just to be clear, for me, for you to be able to retrieve the data from NHS Digital, do you need the patient consent, or is anybody's consent okay?
Do you want me to cover this, Karen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so when we first did the study, it became clear from Helen's work as well that there was a subset of patients who we couldn't get informed consent from. We need that signed informed consent to get the person identifiable data to NHS Digital and to TARN to match up the patients so we can get the follow-up data we want. So this didn't happen for that group, so we applied for Section 251 support, which is a waiver of the duty of confidentiality, so that if we can't get informed consent from a patient, that we can use that support to get the patient identifiable information. And that was split between patients before the 26th of January 2020, we can only collect the data for patients that weren't approached, but for patients without signed consent after that date, we can collect the follow-up data.
Okay, so you just need to know that there is some form of consent in place, essentially.
Yeah, and the level of consent forms that everyone's been filling in so kindly, I do appreciate there were so many that Amy's collected and the data management team's collected. That's really what's informing the spreadsheet that Ross has given us well, so we know exactly who to ask for, and we make sure that there's no breach of confidentiality for patients where we can't receive their data.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Okay. So if there's nothing, if anything pops up in your head, pop it in the chat. In the meantime, we thought we'd go through a couple of studies with you so you can fulfill your CPD requirements and it can be of some wider use, hopefully. We've just got, Nikki's going to present some data on in vitro testing of the effect of cryoprecipitate, and we thought we'd give you 5 minutes on the results of the iTactic trial, although many of you will know that already. But I think that's, Nikki, are you okay to start?
You're on mute.
Sorry, I just swore then. Good. Hopefully I can swear. I mean, not swear, share is what I'm trying to say. Jeez, honestly. Right, okay. Is this all okay, folks?
Yeah.
Lovely. So I'm going to very quickly go through, and this perhaps might fill in some of the stuff that Dan was asking about a little while ago. So this was some of the work that my postdoc Gail Morrow did recently, basically looking at the question. So I think CRYOSTAT 2 is going to answer the question, will fibrinogen replacement be efficacious? Will it improve outcomes? What we then don't know is, because nobody has demonstrated any difference between yet clinical outcomes, bleeding outcomes, etc., between fibrinogen concentrate or cryoprecipitate. So we wanted just in an in vitro model to look at whether there were any differences between these two. So just to set the scene, as you all know, fibrinogen is low in trauma. We know that, that's why we're doing this study, and they predict mortality. We also know from previously that if you have a ROTEM that is coagulopathic, so traumatic coagulopathy, if you add fibrinogen, you change the ROTEM trace to suggest that you are reversing some of the degree of that coagulopathy. And we've done that and demonstrated that that's possible with both cryoprecipitate and fibrinogen concentrate. So what we wanted to do was to model a little, and this is a very, very crude model, so please take that as a very crude model. We wanted to model traumatic coagulopathy by using initially fibrinogen deficient plasma to mimic the fibrinogen loss that we have in trauma patients when they're bleeding. And so we took fibrinogen deficient plasma and then we treated it with either fibrinogen concentrate, which is the standard CRYOSTAT that we use in this country mostly, or cryoprecipitate, which was standard cryoprecipitate from NHSBT that we bought. So first thing that we did, we demonstrated very easily and very clearly that if you add fibrinogen, either in the form of fibrinogen concentrate or cryoprecipitate, the Klaus fibrinogen rises according to the amount that you give. So that's very straightforward and that's helpful and that's what you wanted to see. What we also were able to demonstrate were that, as we saw in that second slide that I showed, what happened with the ROTEM changes, we can see very clearly that XTEM and the FibTEM measures, which I haven't shown, are exactly the same. ROTEM parameters change significantly and are strongly correlated with fibrinogen, the amount of fibrinogen that you give. And that is the same with both cryoprecipitate and with fibrinogen concentrate.
Nikki, you might need to just explain what some of these parameters are, because I think not everyone will be familiar with ROTEM.
Fair enough. Good point. Sorry. Thank you.
Klaus fibrinogen, actually, come to think of it.
Okay, so the Klaus fibrinogen is the standard. If you ask for a fibrinogen measurement in the laboratory, the Klaus fibrinogen is what you get. That is a measure of activity. And so that's our standard measure currently of fibrinogen level. And what we're looking at here is one of the ROTEM parameters, and we're looking both at the speed at which we develop a clot, which is the clotting time here, and then the strength of the clot. And the higher this is up, the stronger the clot. And you can see that as your fibrinogen level that you give back to this fibrinogen deficient plasma rises, the clot strength rises. And now cryoprecipitate can only get to a certain level because you're kind of, it's got a lower fibrinogen concentrate concentration comparative to fibrinogen concentrate. However, they both work exactly the same in terms of improving ROTEM parameters. When you start to look at the differences, there are several differences, and I think this is where the start of questioning which one of these products is better, or I say better, is, well, who knows, but there might be differences. So when you start to look at fibrinogen deficient plasma spiked with either fibrinogen concentrate or increasing concentrations of cryoprecipitate, what you can see is that the fibrinogen, with increasing levels of fibrinogen, the factor 8, the von Willebrand factor and factor 13, and these are all important coagulation factors that help to improve the clot strength of a patient's clot. Does not change really with fibrinogen concentrate, but rises in a dose-dependent manner with cryoprecipitate. So is that important? is a question, and it's a hypothetical question, because as yet we don't know the answer to that. The other thing, which probably also reflects what's happening with the factor 8 concentrate, so as you remember, with adding cryoprecipitate, you're increasing the amount of factor 8 that you're giving. Thrombin generation is dependent on clotting factors like factor 8. Thrombin generation is something that's really important. It allows you to make a stable clot. So you need to have a decent amount of thrombin generation. And what you can see here, and I'll just take you to the most important one, which is your ETP, which is how much thrombin generation is produced. As you give cryoprecipitate, your thrombin generation rises. With fibrinogen concentrate, it doesn't really do very much. Final thing that I think is probably actually one of the more important ones is what we then went on to do was we had either the fibrinogen deficient plasma with either fibrinogen concentrate in it at a range of concentrations, so a low concentration, an average concentration, which is the same as if you got a fibrinogen level back from a patient of 2, or if you got a fibrinogen level back from the patient of 3. So this is low, this is normal, and this is at the slightly higher. And if you compare either giving that quantity 0.5, 2 or 3 of fibrinogen concentrate compared to cryoprecipitate, and then look at the clot that is formed under confocal microscopy, it's called, you can see how the clot strands form. And you can see quite clearly that the clots, to my mind, that are produced from cryoprecipitate look how you would like them to look, and they look a little bit disordered with fibrinogen concentrate. Now, I want to put the caveat across that this is a model, but what we want to know is whether this actually translates into what happens in patients. And the final thing that I think is really important is that we all know that tranexamic acid improves outcomes in these patients, and that hyperfibrinolysis is one of the important changes. So clot breakdown, massive clot breakdown is what happens in these trauma patients. And what we know, what we know in cryoprecipitate is that cryoprecipitate has high concentrations of proteins that inhibit clot lysis, clot breakdown. And when you then do a measurement called a clot lysis study, where you look at how long it takes for a clot to break down, you can see that the time increases beautifully, which is what you would want to see. So the clot is more stable the more cryoprecipitate that you give. Whereas with fibrinogen concentrate, the more fibrinogen you give, it does not alter. And I think the most important reason for that is this fibrinogen concentrate does not contain alpha-2 antiplasmin. Cryoprecipitate contains a lot of it, and that is the most important inhibitor of clot breakdown proteins. So I think CRYOSTAT, as I said, is going to answer the question, does fibrinogen work? What we then need to think about really ultimately is which source of fibrinogen is more important. And I think you're never going to be able to answer that from a large clinical study comparing the two products. I think it needs to look at more of what happens mechanistically and what happens at the endothelial surface with these products. And what we're going to do is actually, we have got samples from the Feisty study, Daniel will be pleased to know, and we are currently running those assays looking at clot lysis. We're looking at mass spectrometry to look at the amount of alpha-2 antiplasmin in the clots, and so on and so forth. So we will hope to add to the data that we've already just published. So I will finish there, sorry, and just acknowledge my postdoc Gail, who's done a lot of this work. So thank you for all of that. I hope that made sense, because I recognise that sometimes I have my hemostasis hat on and don't quite always say what it is. Is that all right?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Nikki.
Any questions?
Yeah.
I've stunned everyone into silence. Okay, good.
I think that's, you know, it's interesting. Dan talked about the Feisty trial, and there was a FinTech pre-hospital trial of fibrinogen concentrate also, which was carried out in Austria and Germany. both pilot studies, and neither of which showed a particular signal for benefit, and they were very similar to CRYOSTAT 1, which did show a potential signal for benefit. So, which is why it's a little disappointing to see pre-hospital services move to fibrinogen concentrate before we get, data on it. But, it is what it is, and we can work around those as always. So, but I think it is going to be interesting then to see, whether cryo's got some magic sauce in it that fibrinogen concentrate hasn't, because the other side of that, of course, is that it is taking us quite a long time to thaw out cryo and get it into patients, and whether being able to draw something up in a syringe and give it, although it's not that easy to draw up fibrinogen concentrate, it makes a difference. So I think this isn't the last, the CRYOSTAT 2 won't be the last word on fibrinogen, but hopefully it will be a very loud word. In one way or the other.
I think if it's positive, though, it will help to move forward, getting either some lyophilized cryoprecipitate, because you could imagine having vials of cryoprecipitate in the same way that you might have vials of fibrinogen concentrate.
Yeah, and certainly I think lyophilized cryo is now, or freeze-dried cryo, I think is now available, and potentially something that could be adopted. As is pre-thawed cryo potentially, if it came to pass. What was I going to say? Simon Carley's posted, what's the next study for major trauma patients so we can keep this momentum going? That's a very good question, Simon. I think you're right. There is a momentum here that we should keep going. I think there are some ideas for studies. You'll see that there was one on the program about traumatic brain injury coagulopathy, which we had very good feedback for, but subsequently got rejected by the NIHR. Although invited to resubmit, we were hoping that there would be something specifically focusing on brain injury. Maybe we can make that work in a different way. I think there are a number of other options as well, moving things from phase 2A into phase 2B or 3 that we can do across major trauma centres. But also, any suggestions, we'd be happy to help take ideas forward from other people, or assist, but absolutely keep the major trauma research network together and going. Okay, I've got a few slides on iTactic. So some of you will know iTactic intimately, but it was a study that we started running across our European partners that we've been working with here at Royal London for about 10 years. And it was the culmination of a European funded project to look at the role of personalising transfusion care with ROTEM or TEG. And there was a little bit of overlap between iTactic and cryo, so iTactic and cryoprecipitate. So we was there overlap? I actually can't remember now. I think there was. Anyway, the principles and the rationale for it go like this. So trauma patients get a coagulopathy, and it's actually quite a complicated coagulopathy, it turns out. But if you look at on a time-based view, very early on they get something because of how they're injured, the injury and level of shock that they get. And that develops within minutes of injury and is characterized by a very low fibrinogen level, as well as hyperfibrinolysis, for which we get tranexamic acid, and also a platelet dysfunction that we don't really know what to do about. And they come and they start getting blood products or fluids, and no matter what you give or how you try, they will get a resuscitation-induced coagulopathy, which is dilutional primarily, but also has other factors to it. So they end up with this complex situation where they get a multifactorial, multidimensional coagulopathy. And then, of course, later on, if they survive, they become procoagulant and more prone to blood clots, DVTs, PEs, and things. So they sort of switch from one to the other. So what we're trying to do when patients come in is deal with this and work out what's going on with them. And so there's two things that we have to consider, if you like, when we treat people. We have to prevent people getting worse by virtue of the underlying coagulopathy that they're likely to get if we resuscitate them. So you have to give the best fluid or transfusion practice that you can. And then you have to try and recognize and treat anything that they either come in with or that they develop over the course of time. And so the way that we prevent coagulopathy at the moment is that we give red cells and plasma as a sort of whole blood equivalent, which is the best we can do really to try and reduce the progressive coagulopathy that they get. And then what we do in terms of cure at the moment is really limited to giving tranexamic acid to begin with empirically, and then act on the basis of whatever lab tests that we might get back in time. And then, of course, a lot of people have a lot of interest in these point of care tests like ROTEM or TEG as to whether they might allow us to correct things faster and in a meaningful way for these people by giving bedside readouts of what the coagulation status is. So TACTIC was essentially a trial that treated everyone with 1-to-1 tranexamic acid and gave a standard of care, and then layered on top of that a randomization which was either into a group that had additional products given by lab test results or they had additional tests given by ROTEM or TEG results. And it was done in 6 centres across Europe, including Oxford and the Royal London here. So, and these were the algorithms which we'd previously worked out before by looking at about 2,000 patients worth of data to try and identify the best thresholds. And so we developed algorithms for if you only had lab tests or conventional coagulation tests, and if you only had ROTEM and TEG tests, what the thresholds for these devices would be. Importantly, we guessed at what the right dose would be for these patients. So we still don't know what dose is best to give fibrinogen or to give platelets, but we chosen these algorithms to suggest 4 grams equivalent if you got a low level back. You know, the CRYOSTAT is actually giving a 6 gram equivalent of fibrinogen, and that might become important later on as well. So it was conducted between about 5 and 3 years ago, 5 and 2 years ago now, and published late last year. And essentially we randomized patients on arrival, very similar to how CRYOSTAT randomizes patients, but instead of randomizing to cryo or not, they got randomized to having either treatment guided by lab tests or treatment guided by CCT. And we had some pre-specified subgroups, and I'm not going to go through the trial in detail, but just talk through some headline studies. So just under 400 patients included. What I would say is that it was a very, very difficult study to deliver. So you enrolled a patient, you took a blood test and put it through the ROTEM or TEG, and then every 4 units of blood you had to do it again. You either had to take a lab test or a ROTEM and TEG test, and then you had to activate the lab based on that, and you had to get your products from the lab and you had to get it into the patients, and then you would go around it again, and you would do this repeatedly until the patient stopped bleeding or died. So really quite difficult and really quite challenging, and you know, that also meant that there were a number of gaps between, you know, where patients perhaps didn't get a value at certain 4 units or didn't get all the tests because it just wasn't actually possible to deliver that. And so the key things in terms of the what we found then in terms of the process of care was that ROTEM and TEG picked up about 2/3 of patients who needed an additional intervention, whereas conventional coagulation tests, so the lab tests, prothrombin time fibrinogen, only picked up about a third of them. There was a bit of difference on average between the time that you would get your first intervention, about 20 minutes, but it wasn't, you know, a huge difference. And again, I think this reflects the fact that we're still ordering frozen products from distant labs that have to be thawed and given to patients. But patients in the Rotem and TEG arm, the viscoelastic, the VHA is viscoelastic hemostatic assay, basically Rotem or TEG. About the same units of FFP and red cells, but more likely to get fibrinogen either as cryo or fibrinogen concentrate, depending on which country you're in, and more likely to get platelets. Although the median was 1, they're more likely to get 2 or more platelets. So overall, in terms of 28-day mortality, we didn't see a significant difference between the two groups. But the overall odds ratio was 0.84, so about a 16% reduction in the odds of death in the Rotem and TEG group. Now, it wasn't significant, obviously, but in the patients who were coagulopathic at baseline by the prothrombin time ratio, it was down. Those who were massive transfused, it was down. Those who had brain injury, which I'll come back to, it was down. Those who were on prior or anticoagulants, it was down. So there was some biological suggestion that there was a consistent effect across the groups, and it may be that we were actually just underpowered to find the study answer. And part of that is because only about a quarter of the patients were actually coagulopathic by PT at baseline, and I think that reflects the improvement in pre-hospital and early transfusion care that we've seen in the past few years. Patients are not getting much crystalloid or colloid before they get to hospital. You know, patients are able to get early plasma. Sometimes in the field they're able to get red cells and plasma, and so we don't have the level of coagulopathy that we previously would have expected in this significant group of patients. But in those who were coagulopathic, the odds ratio was 0.56, so nearly a halving of the odds of death if it was real, but we don't know because it wasn't statistically significant. The brain injury subgroup was interesting though. So 73 patients, not only were they bleeding, but they also had a severe traumatic brain injury, and in that group we did see a signal. So these are the survival curves for overall, and these are the survival curves for patients with brain injury. And the odds ratio of death was about a quarter, so you're about 4 times less likely to die, or 5 times less likely to die if you have a brain injury if you were in the VHA arm. And even when you adjusted for confounding factors, it actually reduced. So it seemed that there was you know, an even bigger signal in the brain injury group. We don't know what the rationale for that is yet, and that was part of the reason for pushing further study into patients who've got brain injury to see whether we can look at specific coagulation defects that they might have. So I won't go through these, but I think the issue is, I think, whether you believe it was a negative trial or whether you believe it was an underpowered trial, and I think that will depend on what your preliminary thoughts about these devices and point of care testing are. My read of it is that it's probably underpowered and that there is an important signal there. The brain injury signal is potentially important, although of course it's a subgroup and so it's difficult to be definitive about it. But I think you know, you don't know whether a patient who's activated the major hemorrhage protocol has got a brain injury before they come in, so you can't wait for CT scans and things before you activate these things. I think you know, it's the spark of some discussion as to whether we should include these tests as part of major hemorrhage protocols and whether we'll see them coming into practice more and more. What I do know is that no one's ever going to do this trial again because it was horrible to deliver it, and I think, you know, probably we need to simplify the way that these machines are used as well, so that you can actually deliver, you know, you can actually use them in a meaningful way. So again, definitely not the last word on any of this, but certainly suggestive that there may be benefits in the future. It's a bit hard to know what you follow on, how you follow on from that though. Let me stop sharing. So that was quick, sorry, but happy to take any thoughts or questions. You may just think it's a negative trial, and maybe it was as well.
So just from my point of view, I think even though it was a negative trial, if I look at it that way, you can also look at it in the sense of saying actually it is not worse than CCT, the conventional clotting test, and so therefore it should be an option that's available for people to use, is the way that I would also think about that too. Don't know if that's fair.
Yeah, so I think that what's interesting as well is that even in the conventional coagulation test arm, patients were having labs sent every 4 units of blood, and they were getting those results back as quickly as they could and acted on. Whereas, you know, I know here we don't do that at all. You know, and even if we do get a test back, we don't get the fibrinogen back for ages, or nobody looks at it. So, you know, and we're just looking at the actual levels of you know, those clotting tests over time and seeing whether they are different. But I think what it does show is that if you actively monitor these patients by whatever coagulation test you can, then you know you will achieve something. But of course we don't know whether that's better than doing nothing.
Karim, it's Laura Green here from Royal London. I've got 2 questions. In the iTactic trial, are you doing cost-effective analysis of these devices? I mean, I agree, it's lovely to have them, but it's just sustaining them and maintaining and training. I've got 2 questions. And the second one is, Nikki and Simon and myself and Beverly are revising the BSH major hemorrhage guideline. And they've dumped me to write on the recommendation for the ROTEM and TEG on the...
They've given you the honour. Is that what I heard? They've given you the honour.
Yeah. To write the recommendation for ROTEM and TEG. And I think the UK will follow. So please tell me, how would you word the recommendation for the use of ROTEM and TEG in trauma? Thank you.
That'll cost you.
Of course it will.
Do your work for you. The first question, yes, there is a cost effectiveness analysis going on in Copenhagen at the moment, which I haven't seen yet. I mean, the problem is if you have a negative trial, it's, you know, the cost effective analysis becomes slightly moot. But I think if you believe the brain injury subgroup, then obviously things potentially become interesting, because if you save the life of a brain injury and they're not left very dependent, then potentially that does have a big cost saving associated with it. So we're waiting to see what that shows. I don't think I'm the best person to talk about how ROTEM and TEG thing, because I'm obviously got a bias now, and it doesn't really matter what I say that you know, people shouldn't listen to me. So what I will say is I think most clinicians find it very hard to go back after they started using ROTEM or TEG, not necessarily because of the clinical effectiveness of it, but because it's like having a monitor for the coagulation system, and it allows people to visualize what's going on. And you know, it's like most people wouldn't give up their capnograph or their you know, once you start using it, even though it's, you know, standard of care now, obviously. So you know, it makes people think about coagulation, it makes people act on it and test it and things. So I think it's very difficult, but I'm not going to give you an answer.
Laura, I'll give you a comment.
Very helpful, Corinne, very helpful.
Laura, so I think what's going to be interesting is with CRYOSTAT 2, if it shows a positive finding, because the thing with the ROTEMs, I think people always struggle with, and TEGs, is that because you see an abnormality and then you act on it, you know, and you've got a greater opportunity to act on it because you've got more points and you get an earlier availability with the Rotem and the TEG and trauma. But whether or not actually the correction makes any difference. So if Rotem is positive, if the CRYOSTAT 2 trial is positive, and you know lots of the patients in ITAC that were getting fibrinogen, that was the primary deficit you were correcting, then I think you've probably got, you know, a stronger case in the face of a negative trial to say that, you know, acting or diagnosing and acting on that deficit is important.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. Thanks.
What I would say is that, you know, if it was an underpowered study, in the coagulopathic arm, there was a mortality reduction of nearly a half. And I think that's very hard to ignore.
Laura, we can write something about broadly saying we are supporting. Yeah, we don't have to say we strongly recommend. We can say we broadly support. Simon, why are you shaking your head? Anyway, we're going off point.
Yeah, we're off target.
It does. I'm not going to go into the details, but I think many of us know this is where guidelines can be quite a challenging exercise. You know, they can set the parameters for what you can say, and sometimes, you know, if you follow the process, then you know you have to be careful with what you can draw based on adequately powered studies. But I think, and I'm being honest here, I think that's also where guidelines do have their limitations, and trying to find something. But we all, you know, we all draw on them. I think, you know, guidelines are a useful tool, but the process by which you formulate those recommendations, and the kind of strictness of those can sometimes be quite limiting in its own right. So Laura, it's still with you, I'm afraid.
No, I suppose the reason why we do all these large trials is to change practice and therefore feed into the guidelines. And that's why with Karim saying that there will be no such a similar trial again, and I completely agree with him, because I also believe how challenging it was. It's just we need to try and do something with the trial that we did and try and understand it better and make some sort of guidance and recommendations for other hospitals in the UK.
And I think that's what was done with PROPER. You know, when we did the NICE guidelines, we looked hard at the PROPER data, which was also a negative trial. But we also recognised that it was the only trial of its kind that would ever happen, and we felt that the signal was strong enough and the downsides few to adopt one-to-one resuscitation practice across the UK. You know, it's
yeah, correct. And that's why I thought asking Karim and Ross about how would you, since you know the data inside out, getting that insight, I thought would be quite useful.
Good. Okay. Any cryoprecipitate questions? Okay. Now I saw Jeanette on the line, but I also saw her leave the meeting. So
no, I'm on.
Oh, Jeanette. Hi.
Hi.
So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jeanette from Houston, who's well, introduce yourself, Jeanette. But basically, it's taken us a long time to get to this point, and the Houston team have put in a huge amount of work with the FDA and locally to get this study approved. It will be the first, I believe, transatlantic trauma study, and it'll certainly be the first study that this university has ever sponsored with well, not sponsored, but you know, co-enrolled with, having the FDA involved. So it's although it's, you know, we've got 8 months to go, it will be great to have Houston on board. So Jeanette, we wondered whether you'd introduce yourself and the team if they're with you and say hi and what you're
okay. Well, thank you for the introduction. My name's Jeanette Podbilski, and I have been highly involved with this study for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, I think already. I was the project manager, program manager for our research group, which is the Center for Translational Injury Research, until the end of January, when I retired from my full-time position. And now I am back helping out as transition to get everything going. So for those of you who may not know the whole process with trying to do an exception from informed consent study in the US, it requires what they call community consultation and public notification. And we have to, because of that, we have to file an IND application with the FDA, which takes some time. So we got the FDA application, we got the IND, and then we had to go out and start reaching out to the community. And our local regulatory committee requires us to do community meetings to cover all the different ethnic, social, economic, and race groups. So in the city of Houston, and our hospital covers 6.5 million people. You can imagine that that's a task. And then as well, we also reached out with a Facebook ad, which reached out to many, many people. And then that connected them to a link to the website. And that way we could track all of the demographics about who was responding to the Facebook ad, how long they were on the page, did they go to the website, etc. And in addition to that, we have to do public notification, which is like media releases, newspaper releases, etc. So we were in the process of going through that entire process when COVID came. And as everybody else, we basically were shut down last year in March. We did not do any research for 2 months. And then we resumed our research May, going back to full coverage in June. But it was difficult trying to get on board with meeting with different community groups to complete our task. We were able to finally do that and got our IRB approval, working with contracts and grants. We're now to a place where we are ready to start enrolling. And the last, in fact, Dr. Cotton and the group that is there at UT now is meeting with the blood bank today to finalize the process and the orders and everything when a patient's enrolled into the cryo arm. And I believe their goal is to start enrollment on May 1st or very close to May 1st. Because of all the delays, it will just be the UT site that will be involved from the US. Originally, we were looking at 4 or 5 sites, but we'll just go with UT. And our trauma volumes are breaking records every month. I think that it will not be a problem being able to enroll patients into this study for you. In regard to the EFIC, what happens is once we get approval, we enroll the patients, and then we have what we call research assistants, which are there 24/7, and they respond to every trauma activations and work and get patients randomized and follow them. And as soon as they either are able to consent themselves or family is identified, we start the process of getting consent.
Brilliant, thanks, Jeanette. I mean, I think you know, the team here have put our protocol and ethics into the you know, the ethics committees and the various regulatory bodies, and I think our paperwork ran to, I don't know, 100 pages or 150 pages. Your FDA submission was bordering on 900 pages by my recollection. So I mean, we fully appreciate the work that you've put into it. And I think the other thing is that we've seen how, you know, for example, the CRASH-2 trial of tranexamic acid didn't have good uptake in the US. And which is why I think we think it's really important to have you on board, and you know, so that we can really have a proper transatlantic representation, because obviously it's a big, not only a big user but also a big influencer in the trauma world. So you know, having Houston and you know, even for the last 8 months is going to be really important, you know, for us. So thanks for keeping going with it, even though you've managed to retire in the middle of it.
I have a quick question, Jeanette. How does a kind of profile of the trauma patients you see differ from the ones in the UK, or they're most doing blunt trauma or penetrating, or?
I was looking when early on when you were going through the basic statistics. I think the median age, we may be a little bit older than 39, but it would probably be in the early 40s. As far as gender, we have we agree with that. The main is male is usually around 70%. What has been interesting with COVID is that we have seen a change. Primarily, we had a high percent of blunt, less penetrating, and during COVID, our penetrating went way up. Obviously, now that I haven't been involved in a lot of meetings in the last 3 months, I haven't seen the most recent statistics since more people are getting out. But I would say that's pretty consistent. I think the ISS is also consistent. I was interested in the GCS because I think our GCS median may be a little lower, just because of the volume of people that we have coming in through the helicopter, and many times they have received products on the helicopter and are intubated.
But a lot more gunshots, of course, which will tend to bleed more than stabbing. But certainly in London, they managed to keep stabbing each other all the way through the pandemic, and
yes,
and even more so now. But anyway, no, thanks very much, Jeanette. It's great that you could join us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think that's all we've got on the agenda. Does anyone have any last questions or comments or anything they want to raise? If you want to raise anything offline, feel free to email any of us and we can have a chat. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, giving us a bit of your time. 290 patients, every patient counts. And really from our point of view, it's getting that enrollment, and if you can get the cryo in and get it in early, and really maybe reinvigorate that link between the blood bank and the ED teams to make sure that process is as smooth as possible. And I think if we can focus on those two things, we should have a good run into the end of December and the closure of the trial. So thanks again very much, everybody. Really appreciated. And yeah, we'll be in touch with all sorts of other forms of communication. Take care all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.